News from the United States. A pickup truck driver killed 8 people and injured more than a dozen others when he drove down a New York City bike path on Tuesday. The suspect has been identified as 29-year-old Uzbek national Saifullo Saipov. He was living in New Jersey. He was shot by police and taken into custody after he crashed into a school bus and fled his vehicle. Authorities claim it to be a terrorist attack after the driver shouted Allahu Akbar when he exited the truck. He was reportedly armed with a paintball gun and a pellet gun. Argentina's foreign ministry confirmed Argentine citizens died in the attack. Authorities have found a note describing allegiance to the ISIS from the attack site. The suspect is in custody and has been treated in hospital.
Bicyclists. Sound a terrorist attack. I'm not sure what it is.
After the collision, the driver of the truck, a 29-year-old male, exited the vehicle brandishing 2 handguns. A uniformed police officer assigned to the 1st Precinct confronted the subject and shot him in the abdomen. The subject was wounded and transported to a local hospital. A paintball gun and a pellet gun were recovered at the scene. The subject's identity is not being released at this time, pending further investigation. He did make a statement when he exited the vehicle, and if you just look at the MO of the attack, that's consistent with what's been going on. So that, along with the statement, has enabled us to label this a terrorist event.
The mayor called the attack near the World Trade Center an act of terror and a particularly cowardly act of terror aimed at innocent civilians.
It's a very painful day in our city. Horrible tragedy on the west side. Let me be clear that based on the information we have at this moment, this was an act of terror and a particularly cowardly act of terror aimed at innocent civilians, aimed at people going about their lives who had no idea of what was about to hit them. We, at this moment, based on the information we have, we know of 8 innocent people who have lost their lives.
U.S. President Donald Trump condemned the attack and tweeted, "In NYC looks like another attack by a very sick and deranged person. Law enforcement is following this closely." He further added, and I quote, "We must not allow ISIS to return or enter our country after defeating them in the Middle East and elsewhere. My thoughts, condolences and prayers to the victims and families of the New York City terrorist attack. God and your country are with you," unquote. First Lady Melania Trump also took to Twitter and said, "My heart breaks for NYC today. Thoughts and prayers as we monitor the situation," unquote. The White House condemned the attack. A statement from the White House said, and I quote, "Our thoughts and prayers are with the victims of today's terrorist attack in New York City and their families. My administration will provide its full support to the New York City Police Department, including through a joint investigation with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. We offer our thanks to the first responders who stopped the suspect and rendered immediate aid to the victims of this cowardly attack," unquote. Joining us on the broadcast are Glenn Carl, a former intelligence officer, Stephen Golub, an international affairs expert from California, and our correspondent, Andy Roesgen, who's joining us from Chicago. Going to Andy first. Andy, just for the benefit of our viewers, could you just recount all the details we have till now?
Right. Well, what happened is that this morning, sometime today, this gentleman, 29-year-old Saifullo Saipov from Uzbekistan, he arrived here in the U.S. in 2010. He went to a Home Depot location in New Jersey and rented a truck. When he drove that truck to New York City into Manhattan along the West Side Highway, not too far from the World Trade Center, although we don't know if that is a factor in all this, why he chose that general area. And he began driving quite recklessly down a bike path for about 16, 17 blocks at about 50 miles an hour, mowing down bicyclists along the way. He killed 8 people. 6 of them died at the scene. 2 of them died later. They were all men. From there, his vehicle struck a school bus, and on that school bus were 2 adults and 2 or 3 disabled children, and they were injured, and one critically injured, we understand now. The other injuries, all total now, are up to about 15 is what we're being told. From there, he got out of his truck. He was wearing a tracksuit. He was holding 2 fake guns. One was a pellet gun and one was a paintball gun. Kind of waved them around. He shouted, Allah Akbar, God is great, in Arabic. At that point, a police officer who happened to be nearby shot him in the abdomen. He was then taken to the hospital, to Bellevue Hospital in New York. He underwent surgery. He is out of surgery now and no doubt being heavily interrogated as soon as he comes to. So that's where we stand. And the big question all day long, all night long, has been, was he some sort of lone wolf terrorist, as has been happening in other countries? Or was he part of some wider, larger conspiracy to conduct this sort of operation? All signs at the moment, although nothing has been confirmed, but a lot of signs point to the fact that he might have been a lone wolf attacker. Based on sort of the scattershot way he carried out this attack, his decision on where to go, his carrying 2 guns when, guns are fairly easy to get in the United States. He could have been holding real guns. He had fake guns with him. So all this is kind of leading investigators down that path of thinking that maybe he was a lone wolf. But these are questions that certainly have to be asked and answered at some point.
Absolutely. And that is the big question on everybody's mind as of now, whether this was a lone wolf attack or was there a more coordinated, bigger, sinister plan behind this? I would like to take that question to Glenn Carl. He's a former intelligence officer who's joining us from the United States. Glenn, what do you make of this attack, given your vast experience as an intelligence officer? Prima facie, how do you see this attack? Was it indeed a lone wolf attack, or could there be a more bigger, sinister design behind it?
Well, of course, we don't know any more facts than our colleague just summarized quite well. Nonetheless, I think that the likelihood is overwhelming that this is what some terrorist experts, and I'll include myself among them, are now calling inspired jihadists. They are not ordered directly by or controlled by ISIS or another coherent, cogent terrorist group, but they identify by watching the media and reading with ISIS and jihad, and they are inspired to act alone, and they're encouraged to do so by the various websites and publications, online publications of terrorist groups, ISIS being the most notable one right now. I think it's overwhelmingly likely that this is what the fellow's like. This is the phenomenon of jihadist terrorism that the world progressively has been confronting for over a decade, and it largely is the model now, or the nature of the threat that all societies will face. It's the hardest one to parry because one can penetrate and observe a group, and individuals are very hard to identify. That said, if I may just add one more point, the law enforcement and counter-terrorist authorities apparently were aware of this man, and he is an associate of some sort with 5 other Uzbeks who were detained, I believe, in recent years in the United States for associations with a terrorist organization. I'm not sure if it was ISIS. So he was known, this individual, to the authorities, but that doesn't mean he was considered an immediate threat. Had he been, he would have been detained.
Also, Glenn, there have been a few handwritten notes which have been discovered from near this truck, and these notes are in Arabic, and they indicate allegiance to the ISIS. Now, how real is the threat of ISIS actually having got in place sleeper cells in the United States, people who are part of sleeper cells, and as and when required, they come out and carry out these strikes?
Well, it's a good question to ask, and it's one that we should, to the best of our ability, dispel. This is the kind of fear and apprehension that reflexively will come to people, and that as they talk about what happened, the events, there's an inclination to attribute some sort of coherent order and purpose and structure to what happens. But much more likely is the description that I gave, this individual inspired jihadist. ISIS, for all of the attention that we in the West everywhere have paid to it, and as horrible as it is and has been, it has not been really known for sending operatives who are trained. And there are a couple of instances. I'm not dismissing or unfeeling about the deaths that occurred, but that's not really how they have acted. And it's quite hard to succeed in becoming a sleeper cell. There will be more, but that's very unusual. Much more likely is that this is someone who wanted to make a gesture for what he thinks Islam should be.
Right, and I would like to take the same question to Stephen Golub. Stephen, the fact that ISIS has been trying to make its presence felt across the globe. They have been trying to do everything possible to show the world that they are there, they are alive and kicking. How serious and how real is this threat of ISIS actually having sleeper cells in the United States? People like this particular individual who could be part of those sleeper cells directed to come out and attack at will.
Well, I'll defer to Glenn's experience and expertise and excellent analysis he just offered. If I could expand on it a little, actually, the biggest danger that we face right now is not a lone wolf or even an ISIS sleeper cell, which I agree with Glenn. I think it's very unlikely that it's out there. But the biggest danger we face is overreaction, because that's what terrorists want. They want to terrorize us, obviously, so that we overreact by labeling entire classes of people or races of people or people of a certain background or skin color to be very suspect, that we can't trust them, that we have to monitor them to a point where we're crushing civil liberties and not just engaging in legitimate intelligence and police activities. And if we fall victim to that, that in turn can actually trigger greater support, greater activity by terrorist networks such as ISIS. So there's that real danger there. And I hope that in the United States, in the wake of this attack, there won't be an overreaction. After the 9/11 attacks, whatever President Bush did right or wrong in the months and years afterwards, he was very good at tamping down such an overreaction, such bigotry that could be so counterproductive and so counter to our values. I would hope we have the equivalent leadership now. To be frank, I'm not sure we do.
Absolutely, Stephen, and you made a very interesting point about the overreaction bit. But how do you reckon President Trump is going to respond to a situation like this?
Oh boy, I wish you hadn't asked me that. We have an initial indication of his reaction in one of his tweets. The second tweet he sent out, even before sending condolences to the families of the victims, to the city, he said, as you'd mentioned, we must not allow ISIS to return or enter our country. Politicizing this in some ways, trying to score some points about some policies that he's trying to promote that really will be unproductive or counterproductive in controlling terrorism. He has a history of making some very, very anti-Muslim comments, completely unfounded, that I might add have actually added to bigotry, not just against Muslims, but to people who Americans might see or be concerned as Muslims, and there have even been attacks against Indians in America because of that. As I said, I'm hoping for better leadership from him, but I'm not at all optimistic about it.
Right, and I'll request Stephen, Glenn Carl, and Andy Roesgen to hang on with us. Eyewitnesses described the attack as scary and said everybody should be alert at all times. Meanwhile, in light of the attack in New York, which is currently being investigated as terrorism, Site Intelligence Group is redistributing a dispatch from 2 months ago that showed an individual holding a phone with the Islamic State's logo less than a mile from the scene of today's attack. The photo was disseminated by an ISIS supporter in August 2017. Going back to Andy Roesgen in the United States. Andy, we discussed a while back. Do we have any more inputs or information on when this particular accused is likely to be questioned by the authorities? Also, give us a state of his medical condition. You told us that he has already been operated upon. When is he likely to be interrogated?
Well, typically, they do it right away. It's done as soon as this person can speak and is lucid enough to tell them what they want to know. As I mentioned earlier, they have the option of asking him questions without giving him his what's called Miranda rights, without saying that you need to, that you don't have to talk to us if you don't want. You can choose to have an attorney with you. Anything you can say could be used against you in a court of law. That can be thrown out if authorities feel there is an imminent threat of another kind of threat connected to him. They can ask him directly without anybody else there, without his attorney there, and say, look, tell us more about what you know about what's happening out there, if there is more out there to be known. However, it's been decided that if he gives that information right there, that immediate information, that apparently cannot be used against him in a court of law. So the bottom line is to your question is they'll be asking him as soon as they possibly can. His hospital room is certainly on lockdown now with lots of FBI and the FBI terrorism task force around. And one more thing, we've learned a little bit more about him from reports that are coming in. Reports that a couple friends of his, one from Ohio and one from Florida, where apparently he lived, and apparently he lived in Ohio as well. A couple of friends who were saying that he was a good guy, a nice guy, a friendly guy, a guy who's married with children, and that he liked the USA. So again, nothing that's been confirmed or anything like that, but these are what apparently friends of his, or so-called friends who say they knew him, and who were related to him through their relationship from Uzbekistan, who were also from Uzbekistan, said that he was a nice guy. So that is to be looked into, his background. Also reports coming in that he was a commercial truck driver and an Uber driver at some point. But again, he came here in 2010, and we have no idea of knowing how he might have become radicalized, if he was just inspired by ISIS or radicalized by in more formal training. We just don't know yet.
Right. I would request Andy to stay on with us. Eyewitnesses described the attack as scary and said everybody should be alert at all times.
But I want to know who was shooting.
Supposedly the nigga driving the truck.
He was shooting.
We saw the car and it was like surrounded by rubble, and we saw like this. Yeah, we saw the guy. He looked like he was wearing like dark colors, and I think he had a beard, but he was holding 2 guns. So yeah, it was a little scary.
I don't know. We've been through 9/11, so I mean, but now this truck thing and the cars, using cars against people. I mean, I walk up that road every day, to go to wherever, and it's, I mean, you just have to be very, very careful and vigilant all the time.
We hope and pray for the victims and their families, and for all those who, witnessed it, and make sure the children, are taken care of course. But remember that, New York is a great place to live, and it's a safe place, and it shouldn't really, God willing, it shouldn't, cause fear or panic. Kids should be able to go about their lives, enjoying their childhood. So, as a teacher of young children, that's on my mind today.
There was a group, it was maybe 2 women and children that were running towards me, yelling, he has a gun, he has a gun. So I turned around, but then when I heard the gunshots, I was interested and turned back around to see what happened. I got there about 30 seconds after the shooting. The smell was, very strong of gunshots. There was one man laying on the ground. It looked like he had been shot. And there was another man right next to him who was getting arrested. While this was all happening, I heard another police officer yell that the other suspect ran into the park. So then at that time, they all started chasing after him, and other police officers were clearing the area.
I would like to bring Glenn Carl back into the conversation. Glenn, Stephen talked about overreaction. I would like to take the same question to you. How do you see President Trump reacting to this attack?
Yes, I'm glad you asked me those questions. They're important to discuss, and I wanted to add to Stephen's comments. There are two aspects of terrorist act that tend not to receive enough attention or enter the consciousness of people, officials and the citizens. For a terrorist attack to succeed, really, it needs to have publicity. If it happens in the dark and the silence, no one knows, and it becomes pointless. The whole point of terrorism is to spread terror and fear, and to theoretically achieve some sort of a political or theological end. So if the authorities react by making de facto heroes, anti-heroes from our perspective, but heroes in the eyes of the sympathizers and the perpetrators, then we have our leaders have given the terrorists the success, a large part of the success that they seek. That's a huge error. Of course, you want to reassure the public and take strong measures to stop in advance, if you can, terrorism. But you never should center attention on individuals in a group. Rather, one should make them non-people, frankly. The second part is incumbent on us. I, speaking right this moment on a network, you as a journalist, and the media in general, and the public. These people, I'll use maybe a somewhat ruthless sounding expression, should be killed in the dark and buried in the rain, out of sight, out of mind. If they don't have attention paid to them, then the point of their actions in their own perceptions is vastly diminished. We contribute, the media and our political leaders, to their success by focusing attention on them. We really should not obsess about these people. And law enforcement and intelligence, and sometimes when necessary military officers, should pursue them, but not make these people anti-heroes.
Hold that thought, Glenn. More news just coming in. In the wake of the New York terror attack, US President Donald Trump has reignited the debate around immigration. He took to Twitter to say, and I quote, "I have just ordered Homeland Security to step up our already extreme vetting program. Being politically correct is fine, but not for this." Going back to Stephen Golub. Stephen, President Trump has already reacted. Now he's talking about more stringent norms for immigration. Is this overreaction?
You know, you're asking me great questions. And again, I'll start my answer by saying, however, that I wish you hadn't asked me that, because it's painful to have to contend with, yes, this overreaction. And it's even worse than overreaction. It's exploiting a tragedy for political ends. This extreme vetting might not have kept out this the person who committed this attack or committed other attacks. He comes from a country, Uzbekistan, that hasn't been singled out as a country for Trump's ban on immigrants from or visitors from certain countries. He got here in 2010. People may go crazy, may become disturbed, may become inspired or motivated once they're here, even though they come in with all sorts of legitimate intents. So it is an overreaction, and even to call it an overreaction is in some ways to understate how counterproductive President Trump trying to exploit this issue is. This just builds on, as I said, an anti-Muslim and strong anti-immigrant sentiment that he's trying to promote in the U.S. that runs against our economic, political, and geostrategic interests, and runs even more so against our values.
Also, Stephen, do you reckon we could hear many more announcements from the president in the hours to come? This is just one aspect. He has ordered Homeland Security to step up the extreme vetting program, which is already underway. Do you see more reactions or more reactive measures from the president?
Well, once President Trump gets started, there's sometimes no stopping him. Your guess is as good as mine, but I certainly wouldn't be surprised if we don't. If he issues more tweets or comes out with more, other provocative statements.
Right, and taking the same question to Glenn Carl, who's with us from the United States. Glenn, you heard President Trump has ordered Homeland Security to step up the already extreme vetting program it has. How do you view this?
Well, at best, one can say that it is a political gesture. It's based on, again, at best, ignorance, but in fact, willful misrepresentation of the facts. Trump ran part of his campaign denouncing Obama and the Democrats for being weak on immigration and said that the immigrants, the terrorists, are pouring in, I think was an expression he used. In fact, it took literally 2 years of vetting, a word which is a bad word, but of immigration and security investigations for every refugee who sought to come to the United States. 2 years before they were allowed to come in, because the measures have been, prior to Trump, so thorough. Also, I forget the precise number, but this will give the truth if the numbers are slightly off. Of the hundreds of thousands of refugees who entered the United States from troubled countries, largely Islamic societies, in the decade or 15 years prior to the election of Donald Trump, I think literally 0 of them have been associated with terrorism. The security measures are thorough and have been, and the likelihood of a refugee fleeing death, enslavement, or starvation being a terrorist are infinitesimally small. Yes, this is fear-mongering, and that's what we're dealing with, I'm sorry to say, to a large extent in our political context now in the United States.
Also, Glenn, given the fact that President Trump has already reacted to this terror attack and has made some statements, is there a real possibility of Uzbek nationals now facing a crackdown in the U.S.?
Well, I would not be surprised. Donald Trump would run into immediate legal challenge were he to single out an ethnic group or a religion or a nationality. But there is the authorization. The federal government has the legal right to exclude nationalities for reasons of national security if it's found that there's a justifiable likelihood or reason that you can argue that's possible. So I would not be surprised were Trump to try, given that he reacts viscerally to any sort of unfortunate or notable events, as we've seen within an hour of the event, I think, having happened. So I think that is possible. That we'll see, yes. Now, it's, in Uzbekistan, there are terrorists who oppose the government. It's a secular versus the altered version of Islam that has been propagated and resonated widely in the last 40 years. The reasons we can go into if you want. But part of it is proselytization from ultra-conservative clergy financed substantially by Saudi Arabia over the last decades. And part of the vast part of the explanation is that there's a social dislocation in what have been traditional Muslim societies responding to modernism, and some number of members of which will then turn to violence to try to purify and resist the change. But Uzbekistan does have an issue with that to some extent, and we tragically, I think, are dealing, it sounds like, with at least one individual whose emotions sympathize with that perspective. Trump will try to talk about that, certainly.
Hold that thought, Glenn, and requesting you and Stephen to stay on with us. Here's what we know about the attacker and his condition as of now. The 29-year-old suspect Saifullah Saipov from Uzbekistan drove a rented truck down a bike path near the World Trade Center. He had come to the US in 2010 and is said to have stayed in New Jersey and had an address in Florida. He rented the van about an hour before the attack. Police shot him in the abdomen. He was taken to Bellevue Hospital and is expected to survive. Going back to Stephen Golub, who's joining us live from the United States. Stephen, how do you see the investigation into this case going on from here?
Well, I think it will be extremely thorough. It will certainly, as I believe Andy had mentioned, explore international connections that this fellow might have had, perhaps overseas trips, his social media use, to see what influenced him, what drove him to this. Are there possibly other connections overseas, although it seems unlikely? Kind of tracking down as much as possible every day, month, and year that he's spent in the U.S. Since 2010, and even his life before that, and any international travel he's done since that. Since arriving in the U.S. If I could just add one thing to what Glenn and I were both saying in somewhat different ways, there's just one other dimension to be aware of in terms of President Trump's reaction, is that he's facing a mounting political crisis in terms of the Robert Mueller, the special counsel investigation into his ties with Russia, which could involve illegal financial transactions, obstruction of justice, collusion regarding our last election, Russian interference in our last election. And one of Donald Trump's most effective strategies is to deflect, to set up a smokescreen, to change the subject. And there had been a fear that how will he react to a big terrorist attack in the U.S.? Well, this plays into that tendency of his to exploit such events to try to change the subject, at least temporarily, away from this very, very big threat to his presidency that he's facing. Having said all that, there's a chance he would have reacted exactly the same way, even without the threat that the presidency is facing. But certainly this is something that he is inclined to exploit for his own political ends, as evinced by the tweets he's already made.
Right. And also, Stephen, I would like to ask you what I asked Glenn a while back. Do you see a crackdown on Uzbek nationals in the United States from this point on?
I don't know. It's very hard to predict the direction that President Trump will take. And it's important to remember also that his chief of staff, who's very influential, John Kelly, was the Secretary of Homeland Security and took a very hardline stance on many immigration issues as the secretary before becoming chief of staff. It's conceivable. I guess my greater concern is there'll be just more and more of a promotion of an anti-immigrant stance, an implicit or explicit anti-Muslim stance that will be counterproductive in terms of both our interests and values, regardless of whether or not there's some specific steps taken against people from Uzbekistan.
Right. And going back to Glenn Carl, Glenn, Stephen made a very interesting point. This could come as, I hate to use the words, but probably a blessing in disguise for President Donald Trump to try and deflect attention from other issues which are almost plaguing his presidency.
Oh, I think there's no doubt about that. This is, I don't mean to imply that Trump is happy for the suffering and the deaths. I'm sure he's not. But it is an event that will serve by itself, and certainly through the conscious actions of Donald Trump, to divert attention from what is a historic crisis in the American political system. That's certain. This is part of his Donald Trump's modus operandi. Absolutely, that will occur. Yeah. I also agree with Stephen. The Uzbeks, the poor Uzbeks, are probably going to be are now in the spotlight for this. But the true object of Trump's efforts with regard to immigration is twofold. One, he doesn't like immigration in general because it seems to imply people who do not look like me or him, as in white males or females. And then there's a particular animus and hostility, denied though they do deny it. And nonetheless, it's quite clear the animus and hostility is towards Muslims.
Right, and let's listen in to what the police commissioner and the mayor of New York City had to say.
After the collision, the driver of the truck, a 29-year-old male, exited the vehicle brandishing 2 handguns. A uniformed police officer assigned to the 1st Precinct confronted the subject and shot him in the abdomen. The subject was wounded and transported to a local hospital. A paintball gun and a pellet gun were recovered at the scene. The subject's identity is not being released at this time, pending further investigation. He did make a statement when he exited the vehicle, and if you just look at the MO of the attack, that's consistent with what's been going on. So that along with the statement, has enabled us to label this a terrorist event.
In our city, horrible tragedy on the west side. Let me be clear that based on the information we have at this moment, this was an act of terror, and a particularly cowardly act of terror aimed at innocent civilians, aimed at people going about their lives who had no idea of what was about to hit them. We, at this moment, based on the information we have, we know of 8 innocent people who have lost their lives.
West Street corner, Houston. I caught up getreten met 4 bicyclists. It's sound a terrorist attack. I'm not sure what it is.
Going back to our correspondent in the United States, Andy Roesgen. Andy, any latest information do we have on this entire case?
Well, we can back it up a little bit and tell you again what we do know, and that is that today, sometime, this gentleman, Mr. Saipov, a 29-year-old from Uzbekistan who came to the United States in 2010, rented a pickup truck from Home Depot in New Jersey. He drove that truck then into Manhattan, into New York City, where he went down this bike path, traveling at about 50 miles an hour, witnesses said, for about anywhere between 10 and 15 city blocks of a distance, mowing down bicyclists as he went. In all, 8 were killed. They were all men, 6 who died at the scene, 2 later in the hospital. Now, the injury toll, in addition to the death, the injury toll is up to about 15, we understand. This gentleman then, after hitting these bicyclists, he then smashed into a school bus. And on that school bus, we understand, were a couple of adults and 2 or 3 disabled children. They were injured, including one, we understand, who is critically hurt. From there, he got out of his pickup truck. He was wearing a tracksuit. He waved around a couple of fake guns. One was a pellet gun. One was a paintball gun. He waved them around. He shouted Allah Akbar. A police officer was fairly close, fairly nearby, shot Mr. Saipov in the abdomen. He went down. They rushed him to the hospital. There, he underwent surgery tonight. It is now about 10:12 in the evening here in New York City. And he went through surgery. He made it through surgery, and we expect that he'll be interviewed quite quickly after that, as soon as he is lucid. The FBI and terrorism folks and police officers like to move fast. They have certainly secured his room and sealed it off, and certainly going to interview him at some point. This is the worst terror attack in New York City since 9/11 back in 2001. So it's being treated very seriously. Of course, the big question is, what do we know about the suspect and what was his motivation? Was he part of a larger conspiracy? Or, as many people are speculating here, was he just a lone wolf, a man who may have been inspired by ISIS and by terrorism? There have been reports now that a couple of people who knew him, who called him a friend, both in Ohio, where he may have lived, and in Florida, where we know he had a driver's license, both said good things about him. They said that he was a nice guy, that he was married with children, a happy guy who liked the U.S. We understand that he may have been a commercial truck driver for a while and an Uber driver for a while. But this is all information that authorities are trying to get now and trying to determine, again, was he just a lone wolf guy or inspired by ISIS? As I mentioned earlier, and you may have mentioned this as well, back in 2014, ISIS as a group put out the word across the world to everyone, to anyone who might be inspired by ISIS, to pick up anything they had in front of them, a knife, a gun, get into a car, to carry out these lone wolf attacks. And then we saw that for a while in various cities across Europe, just various men with a knife or with a car going into a group of people. And this may have been part of that. But did he travel overseas to ISIS in maybe Syria, for example? Well, the speculation is no, only because the caliphate, as we know it, has been dwindling. It's been basically dismantled. It's been hit hard by allied attacks in Syria. So there may not have been a place to go to. But again, we don't know for sure. But for right now, the speculation is that he was a lone wolf attacker who probably wanted to get himself killed by the fact that he got out of that car, started waving around these couple of guns, and then was shot by an officer. So the fact that he survived this is very good for law enforcement.
Right. And I would like to bring back Stephen Golub back into the conversation. Stephen, my colleague Andy mentioned a while back that the fact that this person was carrying a paintball gun as well as a pellet gun and shouted Allahu Akbar, which translates into God is great. And as he ran out of the truck, he made these cries. Was he actually trying to get himself shot?
Well, we can't read his mind, but I think Andy's interpretation that he offered earlier, suicide by cop, is extremely plausible. That he, was wielding these minor or really phony weapons so as to induce a cop to shoot him in self-defense and to protect the public. That's exactly what happened. He just wasn't killed in the process. If you could bear with me for just a moment, I just want to add a personal observation to this that builds on what you said about a little bit earlier. I'm a native New Yorker. Years ago, I lived and worked right near where this attack took place. One of the two times over the past several hours where I felt particularly pained was when I first heard the news that this had happened in New York. Even all these years after the trauma of 9/11. And maybe it's similar to what if there were, heaven forbid, another attack in Mumbai, someone from Mumbai would feel, the pain someone from Mumbai would feel. But even more so, the pain I felt was even greater when you told me about President Trump's latest tweet about the extreme vetting and this manipulation of this issue. The first pain I felt was about, what's happened to my city. But the second greater pain I'm feeling right now is what's happening to my country. Presidents have always, in the wake of tragedies or attacks such as this, sought to bring us together. And now we have one who's not. He's seeking to divide us. And I was hoping against hope that President Trump would react better to a major terrorist attack. It's clear now that was wishful thinking.
Hold that thought, Stephen. Here's what we know about the attacker and his condition as of now. The 29-year-old suspect, Saifullo Saipov from Uzbekistan, drove a rented truck down a bike path near the World Trade Center. He had come to the US in 2010 and is said to have stayed in New Jersey and had an address in Florida. He rented the van about an hour before the attack. The police shot him in the abdomen. He was taken to Bellevue Hospital and is expected to survive. Going back to Glenn Carl. Glenn, Stephen made a point about how President Trump's reaction to this tragedy appears to be divisive in nature. He's the way and the tone and the tenor in which President Trump is talking. Stephen says it's more divisive. It's not bringing people together. It's only going to divide them. Your thoughts, please.
Oh, I agree entirely. Trump viscerally uses any public event or any issue that comes to his attention in a way that he thinks will promote his interests without concern for larger social or political ramifications. He engages in, to the extent he thinks his thoughts scorch the earth, really. He doesn't really think, and I'm not trying just to insult him, he has attitudes that pass for what he thinks are reasoned positions. And these attitudes are invariably derogatory towards any party or individual or fact that he thinks challenges these attitudes he has. So I agree with Stephen. It is typical of him, and it does miss the point, twist the point, and make matters a bit worse. Yes. If I could add another point that is rarely talked about in terrorist issues. We focus on the perpetrator, as we logically, and on the response of authorities, but it is not often said, and it needs to be part of our understanding of how authorities and society should respond to terrorism. To what extent humans are not rational beings. When there was a television show 50 years ago when I was a boy, Superman, this is not a joke, this is at all, and Superman could jump through windows and fly. He was seen doing this on television several times a week. The numbers of Americans who killed themselves inadvertently, unintentionally, by jumping out windows to emulate this man who was known to be a fictional character increased dramatically, to the point where the Superman actor had to do public service announcements saying, please, everybody, do not jump out of the window. Why is that relevant? Because when we hear the ideology of jihad, as it's come to be manifest by ISIS or this fellow, apparently, either praised, disseminated, or denounced, it enters the consciousness of people in ways that will affect their behavior. It's 120 years ago, there was a surge and a wave for several decades of anarchism in Western Europe and the United States, where people set off bombs to destroy the system. They had no positive purpose other than destruction. Much of that was because it had a romantic appeal, since it was in the culture of the moment. That's what happens to some extent. Is happening with acts of terrorism now, which is yet another reason why we do a disservice to ourselves by focusing on these people and making them the center of the attention, not just of lost souls who are easily manipulated. All of us have our perceptions shifted by focusing on these people. Just as we're seeing also in the United States with Donald Trump talking about fake news, right. The disbelief by the public of facts, verifiable facts, has gone up substantially. Perception is reality, and focus on an issue makes that seem to be real, and it will be emulated. So that's, I don't know what motivated this man, but I would wager that sought a higher cause than just being an Uber driver, honorable as that is to do, and is probably a bit of this unthinking, emotional copycat.
Right. And going back to Stephen Golub, Stephen, I'll just come to you, Stephen, in a moment. News just coming in. Prime Minister Narendra Modi has tweeted on the Manhattan terror attack. He said, and I quote, "Strongly condemn the terror attack in New York City. My thoughts are with the families of the deceased and prayers with those injured." Going back to Stephen Golub, who's joining us live from the United States. Stephen, we talked about overreaction. We talked about the way President Trump has reacted. How do you reckon President Trump should have been acting in this hour of crisis? How he should be talking, and how should America be reacting to this?
Well, it wouldn't have been a bad start to tweet, what your own prime minister, what Mr. Modi did, condemning the attack and, just expressing genuine emotion about the sadness of the event. And in fairness to President Trump, one or two of his tweets did say something like that in terms of condolences to the family. They came after, and to New York, they came after his first tweet that tried to politicize this issue. More generally, take a page from President Bush or President Clinton or President Obama when we've had other tragedies, other mass deaths of which is to emphasize our common humanity, empathize with the people and their families and their friends and the places that lost citizens, that lost family members. Keep it sympathetic and keep it, in a sense, positive. There's plenty of time to discuss policy and to even to discuss which policies we should pursue later. In the moment, in the hours afterwards, I think it's a good thing to just focus on pulling us together rather than trying to politicize this as he has. And I'm afraid that, look, he is the president. He does have some very devoted followers, not the majority of the country, but maybe about a third of it. And they may take his lead in how he's handling this. One thing I'll add, again, in the realm of wishful thinking, is that a couple or tweets do not a policy make. Perhaps he's just tweeting. Perhaps he's not going to follow this up tomorrow by exploiting this issue even more. But I want to emphasize that's really wishful thinking on my part.